Welcome friends to today's React tutorial. We're going to be covering everything you could possibly want to know, all the essentials so that you can go out and build your own React applications. We're going to start off with a bit of an introductory tutorial, cover some orders of business in the blue that you can see there, and we're going to finish it all off, cherry on top of the cake, by building a COVID application. So just to quickly tease the finished product, we are going to be building this COVID display stats app, where basically you can select a country, look at the confirmed, recovered, and death stats, and some other information, and we'll consume an API for this, and you could look at whatever country that you want, and you get this nice responsive graph. Looks super cute, great on mobile devices, and it's going to be a super cool project. So as you can see, we're going to look at project, folder structure, hooks, functional components, props, Google Fonts, Fontawesome icons, styling, and all that good stuff. So without further ado, let's dive into it. And we are going to begin right here in our terminal by initializing a React project. And so to do that, if you have React installed, we're just going to type npx create React app. And here, if you're already in the project folder, you can click this period, or you can create a project folder, and I'm going to name mine COVID project. Through the power of science and technology, that's all finished, and so now we can cd into our project, COVID project, and we can open it up in our code editor using that special command. So, congratulations, you've officially initialized a React application. Let's have a look at exactly what that gives us. So the first thing to note is that you have a README, super cool. You can put any meta information that you want to record about the project in here. We also have a package.json, and the key thing to note in here is the start script. So we can start up this project by typing, first by opening up a terminal and then typing npm run start. And so that will launch this project on localhost 3000, and we should get the boilerplate code that comes with our React app. So that's super cool. We also have a source folder with a couple of files in here, and we have a public folder with any relevant assets that we might have for our project, such as an index.html file, Google Fonts or images that you might want associated with your project. Now, how does a React project actually work, you might ask? It's not that complicated. Essentially, React is comprised of functional components, and a functional component compartmentalizes logic specific to each component. So for example, we might have an app component that contains all of its children components, and that might be, a header, a nav bar, any of that good stuff, a footer, you might have a modal component, or just any compartmentalized logic that you want to hold together to make sure that it's readable and clear what your application is doing. And so here we also have a lot of subfiles, so you can see that we have a bunch of stuff. We can actually go ahead and delete everything in here except for the index.css, the app.javascript, and the index.javascript. So if we go ahead and delete all of those, that is going to kill our project because we're going to have to quickly just remove some imports. And we can do that super quickly by coming into these two files. And lastly, we also have to remove that import there. So now we have a blank React application, and we have all of our functional components rendered within this return statement here. So essentially, a functional component is just a function, named with the name of the component. Typically, the component will start with a capital, and we return what they call JSX. And so JSX is basically just HTML that you can integrate JavaScript with. And so it allows you to create much more dynamic applications as opposed to just rendering static content. And this app file gets rendered in this HTML file inside of this root div. And so this div with the ID of root works just the same as you would with a regular vanilla HTML file, and this index.javascript file renders out our app component inside of that root component in the index.html. in addition to any functional components that we may have inside of this app.javascript project. So that's pretty much how React renders content on the page, and we can see that if I come in here and type James, that will pop up in that far corner over there just as we'd want it to. Equally, I might say hello, and that will come up too. So that's super cool. We have a boilerplate project just there, and we have some base styling in here, which I'm just going to remove for the second. What do we do next? So, what are the advantages of React? Well, predominantly, aside from being able to compartmentalize your logic into separate components, it's also really good for rendering JavaScript onto your page. And an example of that would be if I have a const variable called James and I say, for example, James is cool, I can dynamically render that within this JSX or this HTML by just simply using these curly braces in James. And so now we can see that this content here gets rendered out in my HTML. And so I could edit this to say James is really cool, and that will update on our page dynamically. So that's super convenient. There's a lot more that we can do. We could also say initialize a boolean, so we could say const bool, and let's just say it's equal to true for the minute. We could pass in a JavaScript statement here saying bool is, if bool is true, then we want to render James, else we want to render maybe he's not. He's not so cool. And so now we can see that if that boolean is true, we render out James, and if I change it to false, that statement updates so it's not so cool. And so that's an example of how you can render JavaScript logic, or sorry, even better said, use JavaScript logic to render out dynamic content on your page. And it also gives me a good opportunity to introduce state. And so state is essentially just the logic that we have here, except it's a much more dynamic equivalent. So it allows the user to interact with it and update it more readily. And so we can import state in our project by typing import React from React. And now we can initialize a stateful variable, which is essentially just the same thing as each of these, but slightly different. So now we use square parentheses, and we initialize the variable as the first item in the parentheses, the square brackets. And the second item is a set function that is typically in the format of just set whatever you've named the actual variable. And we can initialize that by saying useState. So it tells React to set this as a state variable. And in here, we can provide a default value. And so you could leave this blank, just like this, or you could start it off as true. It's totally up to you. And so in this particular case, we can see that already that's working for us. So over here, it's reading in this undefined value or null value, and it's saying, okay, this is essentially false. And so we're rendering out this content just here. And so I could update this so it has an initial value of true, and now it's going to render out the true value just as we kind of had it set before. The benefit is, however, that now I can create some user interaction on our page and make it really dynamic, and I can do that by saying, let's have a div, for example, and I could just say change bool in here as some regular text. I could make this an h1 tag even, and pop this at the end. So now we have this h1 here, and in this div I can provide an onClick handler, and so that is just added by adding an onClick attribute to the tag, and here we use curly parenthesis, and in this case an anonymous function that just returns the set bool, and I'm going to set the new value inside as the argument to the set bool function and just say it's the opposite or the inverse boolean of whatever it currently is. And so now I've created this onClick handler, and we can see that just by adding that set state, that set bool function, it's updating our JavaScript content and re-rendering something new on the page. And so, magic, we now have some great user interaction, super cool. What else can we do? Well, in this particular case, we can actually also import useState just like this, because writing React is not always efficient. And we'll see that that works the same. And it also allows you just to initialize lots of stateful variables all throughout your page. Now, the difference between using a stateful and a standard normalized variable, just like this, is that you would typically associate stateful logic with logic that's going to update depending on user interaction. So if it's just going to be a product of something, you know, like a calculated variable, then feel free to just initialize it as you typically would. Otherwise, if it's going to have a lot of dynamic changing to it, it's, you know, best to initialize it as state. So now that we have some stateful variables, let's try adding a new component. And we can do that pretty easily by coming into here and making a new folder in our source folder called components. And let's say in this particular example, we're going to initialize a navbar.javascript component. So once again, capital here, and the shorthand to initialize a new functional component is RFC, and that will just give you the boilerplate for a new navbar component. So we can render that navbar component onto our page simply by using it as if it were a standard tag. Now we'll have to import it, and so here we can see the auto import wants to work for us, and we can now just render that on our page. Magic, we have a functional component. Typically, the best practice for your app page is to have a majority of your logic in the form of subcomponents, just so it keeps your home app or your parent app really tidy. So now that we have this cool little navbar component rendered on our page, let's see what we can do with it. And it turns out that we can interact with it exactly how we would a typical component, and just put in some new context in here, new JavaScript, JSX, render out whatever you want. You could render an unordered list with list items, James, just like that, so that all works standard. And we could switch the order of all of this, so we could render it at the top. You can do just about whatever you want. But now this logic is compartmentalized into its own component, and it's super concise, tidy, and clean. Now, what if we wanted to communicate state or information or props between two components? How would we do that? Well, it's actually quite simple. And the first thing you have to do is come into your subcomponent, your child component, and just let it know that it's going to be receiving information by giving it the props argument. And so now that we've let the navbar know that it's expecting information, we can pass information down from the parent component to the child component using attributes in the tag. And essentially how this works is we contain a package with our information that we want to pass down. So this says I want to pass bool down, and we provide it in that package. Imagine it's a physical package as bool. And so we wrap that up, and then we assign it a label, and often the label is just the exact same variable name. So just like that. Equally, I could label it James, but whatever you label it, that's what it will expect to see inside that component. And so now if I come in here, I can console.log props, and if I inspect this page, we will see that I do indeed receive a props object that has the boolean and it's set to true. Now, once again, I can update this name to James, and in this particular case, it will receive an object and it's labeled James, but the value will be the value of bool, because that's what's inside the package. Now, to make things even tidier, the best way to actually see what you're dealing with is to destructure the actual variable from props. And now I would just console.log James. And I can remove that. And so in this particular case, we can just see that that renders true. And if I were to click this button here, change bool, we can see that it alternates and the navbar is updating as we would think it would. So we could once again come in here and just render out some JSX conditionally dependent on the value of James. And so if James is true, we can just say it's currently true. Have to add the backslash just in there. It's currently true. Otherwise, we can say false. And so now, depending on the value of bool, we can see that our nav component is updating from the stateful variable initialized in our app component. And so we can add multiple attributes. And so another one would be, I could just say set bool is equal to set bool. And now we can tell our navbar to receive that set bool. And I could say on click once again is equal to the curly braces anonymous function set bool false. And so in this particular case, currently it's true. If I click on that list, it sets it to false. And if I continually click on that, it's just going to continue to set it to false. So now we have a lot of randomly rendering content. What comes next? Well, the last thing to do with these functional components is that if you wanted to have an additional child component, you could just render that out. Let's call it third component. I can pass down all the props from the parent component, the app, down into this one without having to reinitialize them in here with new names, just by spreading props down here. But obviously this third component doesn't currently exist, so that's not going to work for us. But now that we've kind of looked at how useState works, let's just remove all this good stuff. We can keep the navbar component, and let's clear out all of this logic and look at how we can make our app start to look pretty. So the first thing we're going to do to make our app look excellent is we are going to use Google Fonts in this project. And so here I already have it open and I've selected the font Poppins. And so I can import this into my project by copying this link tag and coming into the index.html file in our public folder and copying this link into the head of the document. So between these head tags just here. And so I can just paste that in there just like that. And so that is how we can import that Google font. And we're also going to be doing the same for the Fontawesome icons. And so for that, we're just going to use the CDN package version 6.1. So you could type in Fontawesome CDN 6.1 package and you should find this link. All the links that I use in the project will be in the description, and as will the link for the GitHub repository for the code. But I'm just going to copy this link tag and once again paste it just underneath, just like the other one. Magic, and now we are good to initialize fonts and Fontawesome icons in our project. So how I like to set some global styles on my React project is literally just by opening up a style tag in this index.html and just selecting the entire project and just setting a default margin of 0, a padding of 0, a box sizing, a border box, and lastly setting the font family for my project Poppins with the font that I've just imported and a backup of sans serif. And so the reason I do that is because here we can see our default project has some margin around the edge, and so this will just remove that and apply that font style. Now technically you could actually just come in here and render out some content like you would with a traditional HTML file. That's not a standard practice and I wouldn't necessarily recommend it, but just it's nice and tidy to have this little style tag just here. And that actually allows us to delete this index.javascript file, and we can just remove that from there too. Oh, wrong one. Just like that. So now we've applied our font families. We can come into Fontawesome icons and select some of their free brand solid icons. And I could just say dragon. And here we have a cool little dragon. I could copy that in, paste that into my app. And we also can see that that dragon renders on the page. And so now we have Fontawesome icons working. They're just a great asset to any little project that you might have. So how do we style our apps? Now there are a lot of different ways to style a React app, and my personal favorite is Tailwind, but we're not going to be using Tailwind in this particular project. But the first way we can style an app is literally by adding an inline style. And so we do that by giving the style attribute, and we provide it an object. So this in an object, and here I could say, for example, background, and just set that to green. And so that's going to update the background of that particular tag to green, and just like with a standard object, I could provide a new key and just say min height. I could say 100 view height. And so just like that, that's going to set the min height of the screen all green, and so that's cool. I could equally come in here and say style is equal to font size 10 rem, so that's going to make it a nice big icon, and I could say color white, so that will set the icon to white. Now that's super cool. However, the downside is that it's not very visually appealing, and it can be kind of hard to figure out what styles are conflicting, and it's not very clear. So typically it's not a best practice, but it's there if you want it. Now if I inspect this page, we will notice one thing. We get this error here that says we have an invalid DOM property class. And so we can see that with this Fontawesome icon that we've imported, it's automatically assigned the class attribute. However, in React, class is a reserved term, and so we have to change that to class name, and class names are assigned using the class name attribute instead of the class. And so just like that, we can see that that resolves that error and everything's still working perfectly. So that is inline styles. How else can we style an app, I hear you ask? So the second way we could style an app is with a global CSS sheet. And so in this particular case, I can just make a file in here, and I can call it index.css. And here I could just say body, actually even better, we can see that we already have this class name assigned here, so we could say app dot app and just say background green. And we can import that dot app into our React app by just saying import dot slash index.css. And so now that's going to apply that class name there, and that is a global style, so that the styles in this index.css sheet can be applied anywhere in your app. Equally, we can update that import statement into our index.javascript file just in here, and that will have the same effect, and that will globally apply any classes or styles that you may have in this particular project. Now, once again, I'm not a massive fan of global styles because you can get a lot of styling conflicts. My personal preference is to set a few global styles in your index file and then not stress with the extra files up here, but instead set modular CSS files. And we can create a modular CSS file just by adding the, if I go navbar.module term in between the name of the CSS file and the suffix. And so typically a modular CSS file will be scoped locally to the component that we imported in. And so each component will often have its own modular CSS file. And so now I can come into my navbar and import that. So I could say import styles from /navbar.module.css. Now the styles can be treated as if it were an object, and so in this particular case, if I wanted to, let's say I have Henry in here, and I wanted to also apply a class name here, I could say class name is equal to, and so now I use these JavaScript parentheses around the side, the curly braces, and I select the object and I select the key, which is the class name, so I could just say navbar. Now that's not going to do anything because I don't have a navbar class in my file, but if in here I had .navbar, I could open that up and say background yellow, just like that. And now if we come back into our app.javascript file and render out navbar once again, we can see that that yellow modular style is applied to that navbar specifically. So that's super cool. We have a working modular CSS sheet. You can chain two styles together by using the backticks. And so in here, now what you have to do is still use the JavaScript notation within the backticks, but now we can insert a space and have an additional styles, and so I could call this second style. And so we use camel case in here, And so I could say dot second style color is white. And so we can see that that is how we could apply a second style using this backtick practice. So those are kind of our three main ways of styling an app. We're going to be using modular CSS sheets for this project. And now that we have looked at styling an app, we can get to the best and last kind of tutorial feature, and that's going to be creating our own custom fetch data React hook. And so to do that, in our source folder, I'm once again going to make a new folder called hooks, and in here I'm going to make a new file called fetchdata.javascript. Now I'm going to initialize this the same way I would a standard hook, except I'm going to change the name to useFetchData. The use prefix is standard of React hooks. And for the minute, I'm actually just going to return null. Now this hook is not going to return JSX, and you will see why shortly. So, when making a call to an API, that is an asynchronous call, which means that it has a loading state and also has the ability to go wrong. And so in our main application, that's where we're going to call this custom hook. And essentially what we want is to return a data loading an error state from our useFetchData hook. So we can see that that auto import works. And so our useFetchData hook is going to take a URL, and this URL is going to be equal to something that I have just here. And so in this particular case, the first URL is going to be country's URL, and this is going to be equal to this. And once again, the link for the GitHub repository for this code is in the description, so check that out. Now, how this is going to work is we want our useFetchData hook, which we need to pass an argument to return three states: data, loading, and error. And what we can do in our React app is say, okay, depending on the state of this information, we can render different things. So down here, if I get rid of this content, so in this particular instance, we actually want these two URLs to be rendered into our navbar, because this is going to be where we get all of our information from. But essentially what we're going to do is we are going to import that hook in there. We have to update this URL because now the import is different. So that should be ... And we're also just going to update this export so that we can import it like that. Now essentially how this navbar component is going to work is it is going to be a drop down of all of our different countries that we can select. And so what we're going to do here is have a conditional render that does two things. It either renders out a single div that has one option, and that's global, or it renders out all of our options, which are all of our countries, depending on whether or not the data is loaded. And so how we're going to do that is just by saying loading. So depending on the state of loading, if it's true, we want to render a div that just has the keyword global in it. Otherwise, we want to render out a long list of data related content. So I'm just going to say div for the second, and this div is going to have all of our data. Now, this isn't going to work because currently these imports do absolutely nothing, but we're going to come into our React hook and we're going to tell it to expect a URL. And the reason they call it a React hook is because it uses React built-in hooks such as state. And so in this particular case for this hook, we're going to need useState and useEffect. So here we're going to initialize three stateful variables. So we're going to have data and set data, and we're just going to say useState null. We're going to have const loading, set loading, and that is going to be useState, and that's going to have a default of true until loaded. And then the last one is going to be const error. It's going to be set error, and that is going to be useState null. Now down here we can return these, so we can return data, loading, and error, and that will allow us to import them into this component. And so here, if we come into our main app, we're rendering this. We have this content. And so if I just remove all of that, we can see that global is showing up because our loading is true. And so that's perfect because we don't have our data yet, but as soon as our data comes in, then we will update the state. So now that we're passing the URL, the next thing we're going to do is define a use effect. And so a use effect takes two arguments, where the first one is an anonymous function, so just like that. The second is a dependency array. And so this is essentially just a listening logic block. And so depending on what we give the dependency array, it will listen to changes in those things and run this block, this code block, whenever a change occurs. So an additional option is to pass it an empty array, and that just tells it to run on page load. So in this particular case, we're going to say on change of URL, I want to run some code. And so in here we're going to define a function. We're going to call that fetch. Now fetch is actually going to be an asynchronous function. And the first thing we're going to do at the top of the function is set loading to true, just in case it has an alternate state. Now inside of this fetch function, we're going to try some logic, and we're going to catch any errors. And at the end of each, we're going to have a finally block that sets loading to false. So either we're going to catch the data that we need, or we're going to have some errors, and we'll set the error, and then we'll set the loading to false, depending on the state. Now for this hook, we're going to have to npm install Axios. So I'll just let that run, and then we can start up our project again, npm run start. And we'll have to import, Axios from that particular package, just like that. So in our try block, we can say const data is equal to await. There's that async await logic. And we can say axios.get URL. And so that URL is what's been passed up above. And now we can set data equal to data after that has occurred. If we get an error, we can set error to that particular error.message. And finally, loading will be true. And so now if we inspect this component and come into our nav bar, and let's say we console.log data loading and error, let's see what states we receive. And so in this particular case, we're not getting anything yet because we have defined this function. The last thing we actually have to do is call it, just like that. And so now if we call that function, we can see that we do in fact get that loading state. So I could make that more obvious by just saying loading data, and then the data comes in and we can see what information we have here. So that's super cool. Now this URL actually just needs to be changed to countries, because in this particular case we want to receive a whole lot of countries. And the last thing you can actually do is say if we get an error, so if error comes back true, so in this particular case I'm actually just going to, so if error comes back and something gets set, we're actually just going to return some new logic. So I'm just going to open up a div here and say there was, let's just go with oh bugger. So that's if something were to go wrong. And so an example might be, we can see that that error state gets displayed instead of everything else, but let's just revert that. So that all works nicely. Refresh the page, we get the data, everything's beautiful. What comes next? The next thing we're going to do is start styling out our page by building out a nav bar. And so this particular navbar is going to display either the countries that we have here or some other content. And so for that, we're going to initialize a stateful variable, and we're just going to call this selected and set selected. And that is equal to useState. And we're going to give it a default value of global. Now, this logic is actually going to have to jump into our parent component, so I'm just going to paste it in here, and I'm going to pass it down. Selected is equal to selected, and set selected is equal to set selected, just like that. And so if we come back into our navbar, we know that we can destructure that information just like this. Selected, set selected is equal to props. And I like having this at the top of my page, the first thing that we do. And so now once again, I can render out this selected information just here dynamically. For example, I could say selected, and that is going to come out on the page as global, and that's because that's what the default value is. So I could change that to James, and that will update accordingly. So that's super cool. And additionally, what we're going to do is apply some class names. And so here, I'm just going to call this styles.navbar. And now I'm going to come into this module here, and we're going to have to change some styles up a little bit. This is going to have a position of sticky and a top of 0, and that's just going to maintain our navbar at the top of the page. We're also going to have a background of linear gradient, and this is going to be to right. HSL, we're going to go for a 230 light. Hue saturation is going to be 70%, and we're going to go 8% color. So that's going to be pretty dark, and we're going to go to a 180. 180, 70%. 10%, let's say. Let's see what that looks like. So I don't like that, so maybe what I'm going to say is 280 instead. Cool, that looks kind of fun. Now, if we save that, we're also just going to say color is going to be white for all of the text. We're going to say font size is going to be 2 rem. We're going to have a padding of 4 pixels vertically, 8 pixels horizontally. Just like that. We're going to say text transform, where is it? Uppercase. And 2 more things. We're going to have a display of flex and a align item center and a justify content space between. And so we're going to have a second drop down icon over here that is going to separate the 2 of them. You'll see in just a moment. The last thing we're going to say is user select none. So that's going to mean that they can't select any text items we have. And we're also going to say cursor pointer. So now when you hover, it looks like it's a click down. You could also, if you really want to be fancy, you could say transition duration of 300 milliseconds. And so we're just going to add one last thing. So we're going to add a hover effect. And we're just going to add a color to turquoise. So now when they hover, they get a slight text change color, which just looks kind of cute. I might actually just change that to crimson. I might actually just change that to, what color do we want? We could go with aquamarine. That looks kind of fun. Yeah, just like that. So when they hover over this, it just changes color. Now, in our navbar, the other thing we're going to have, so we have this global state. We're also going to render out our first icon. And so it's not going to be the dragon, unfortunately. It's going to be an arrow. And the particular arrow that we're going to use is the chevron. So we're going to go with the chevron down, just like that. Copy that, paste it in here. We're going to say class name. And I think that should display our chevron icon just there. So that's super fun. And so one example of where I don't mind using inline styles is with icons. And so here we can just say transform, and we're going to say rotate 180 degrees, but we're going to give it some conditional logic. So what we're going to do is we're going to say open rotate 180 degrees, otherwise nothing. So if it's open, it's just going to rotate 180 degrees. Now open doesn't currently exist, and so this is going to be where we set our first piece of state. And so I'm going to do that just here and say const open set open. And this is just something that we can manage locally in this particular case. And so that's going to be initialized to false. And useState is not defined, so we'll just have to import that here, useState. Cool, magic. So now that's obviously not doing anything. What we want is to add an onClick handler to our navbar that once again receives an anonymous function that just says set open, and we want to inverse the current state of open, so whatever it's not. So now I'll close that curly brace, and so what that should do is rotate that icon down the end there. Perfect. Now you could also add in here transition duration of 300 milliseconds, and so that will just slow that rotation down nice and neat. Cool. So I know we said we can initialize this open state in here, but for this app we're actually going to need it into our main component, and we're going to go back and set this to global. Now we can once again pass that down into here by just saying open is equal to open, and set open equal to set open, and the reason we're going to do that will become clear momentarily. So open set open. Cool. Now, as I mentioned, the reason we're going to do that is because we're going to have some conditional rendering in this app that either displays this information page just here, or it displays a drop-down with all the possible countries that we could select from. So I'm also just going to quickly come in here and add some more padding. So let me just design for a mobile device first and say, let's have a look at the padding options. Oops. Inspect, mobile, drop that window down, open that up. Okay, so we just want to make the vertical padding maybe 5 pixels. We could even go for 6. And maybe we want the horizontal padding 10, 20 pixels. Bring it 14. We'll go with 14. That looks pretty good. Perfect. All right, so as for everything else, depending on the state of open, we're either going to render out a drop-down, or we're going to render out a whole lot of content. And so the open state is going to conditionally render either a drop-down, or it's going to render the rest of our page. So now in this component, we are actually going to need one app style, and so I'm just going to quickly make that index.css file and just say .app, because we're going to need some basic styles to our overarching parent component. So the first one is going to be display flex. The second one is flex direction column. The third one is going to be min height of 100 view height. And for the moment, that should just about do it. And so now we can import that in here just by saying import.index.css. So nothing will change, but you will see soon. Now we have the navbar. The next thing we're going to do is make a new component, and we're going to call that dropdown. So dropdown needs to be defined. So we're going to say dropdown.javascript, and we're going to use our RFC key to make that happen. And we're going to come back in here and auto import. So now that displays in here. Perfect. Now we're also going to have an additional component, and we may as well make it now, and we're going to call that main with a capital M, just like that. Now main doesn't exist, so we'll make that too, main.javascript, and we'll go RFC, and once again we'll come back up here and import that just like that. So now these two display. The last thing we're going to do is wrap them inside of a main tag. And what that is going to do is allow us to apply a class name here, and we're just going to say main, and now we can come into this and just say dot main, and we can give it a flex of 1, and that's just going to ensure that this main occupies a majority of the space. And we're also going to say padding of 4 pixels so that it just sits inwards from the edge of the screen a little bit. So that's going to be nice. Now in this main display, we are going to conditionally render these two using some JavaScript. So we're going to say if open, then we want to render our dropdown. Otherwise, we want to render our main. And so we'll see this working just now. So here we have main, the dropdown is closed. The dropdown is open, so we're rendering the dropdown is closed, so we have global. Cool. That is working nicely. Now for our dropdown, we're going to come into here and we are going to receive some props. And so the props that our dropdown is going to receive is actually going to be the data from our navbar, which means that we're actually going to have to copy this logic into our app, paste it in here, and pass it down as props to our navbar. So here we're going to have data equal to data, loading equal to loading, and error equal to error. And the reason we have to do this is because we need our dropdown to be able to access information in addition to our navbar. And so now in our navbar, we can come in here and tell it to expect this information. So let me just enter these onto a new line like that. And so now I can just say data, loading, and error. And useFetchData is not defined, so I'm going to copy this import statement into our app, just like that. And it cannot recognize that because that folder just needs to change that import. Cool. So now that's once again working, and we can pass that data into our countries component just like that. And so first what we're actually just going to do is add in some conditional rendering here. So we're just going to say loading is false and main. So this statement basically does a check on this. So if it's true, it will render out this content. And so just adding in this little check here means that this main div will only be rendered once loading is true. So just like that. So it won't get any issues. Now if we come into, let's save our navbar, we're receiving data in here, which we now don't actually have to do. So we can remove that. We can also remove set selected because we don't need that from that, and that's actually that component completed. However, in our app component, we're also going to have to pass down set selected because this is where we're going to update the value of the selected that's displayed up here. So now if we go down into our dropdown, we'll receive all of this data, so we can destructure that from this prop. So we can say const data set selected is equal to props, just like that. And so now in here, I'm going to say class name of styles.dropdown, which we haven't created just yet. So I'll have to make that new file, dropdown.module.css. So we can import that, import styles from /dropdown.module.css, That's all happy. And now here we're going to do some mapping of content. So mapping is a great way to render reused logic or map out an array of information without having to write it all out statically. And so before we do that, let's just look at what our data is. So we're going to console.log data, load the page. If we check out the console, we can see that it only renders when we do that, which is cool. So here we have countries. Now each country is going to have a name, and that's what we're going to want to access. So we're going to render data.countries, and we're going to map through that. So this is going to be a particular country, and we are going to return country.name. So here I could just say, I could in this particular instance initialize a new variable and just export that and just say const countries is equal to that. And so now I can just say countries, which is an array of country names, dot map country name. And in this particular case, we're also going to want to select the index, which you'll see why in a second. So I'm going to take the index, which is the second argument, open that up, and I'm going to return some additional JSX. So I'm going to return a div which inside contains the country name. So now if I render this out on the page, we can see that we get a whole lot of country names, which is super cool. Our global sits there nicely. I might actually just come back into our navbar dot, because I don't believe it actually needs that style just there. So instead we can just, no, we do in fact want that. Cool, so that works. Now we have our drop-down list, which is super cool, of all of our different countries, and it only shows when we open that up. So that's absolutely perfect. You will, however, note that we're getting this error here. And so each child, for the efficiency of React, React needs to identify every mapped child. And so in this particular instance, what we're going to do is have to provide a key to the parent div that gets mapped out. And it just needs to be a unique identifier, which is often just the index. And so now if I refresh this page with that key, we can see that that error has gone away. So that's super cool. What do we do next? Well, I reckon it's probably not a bad idea to style these divs just here. So the first thing I'm going to do is put this inside of the first thing I'm going to do is apply some styles. So I'm going to say class name is equal to styles dot drop down item. And so in our drop down, we can say dot drop down, which is the first one. And so that is going to be a display of flex, a flex direction of column. We're going to give it a gap of 3 pixels. And that should just about do it for the second. And we're going to say drop down item. And for this, we're going to give it a transition duration of 300 milliseconds. And we're going to apply a dot hover to our drop down item. So hover, we're going to say transform translate X, and we're just going to say 10 pixels. So it's just going to move it X 10 pixels, and we're also going to give it a color of turquoise. So let's see how that looks, just a bit of a random guess. So now if I come back onto the main page, we can see that when we interact with it, it kind of just moves them out like that, which is just a bit of fun. Now we're also just going to set a cursor pointer on it, and we're going to add a select none so that users cannot select them, and it's just like that. Cool, that's super cute. Now, the last thing we're going to do is come back into our app, no, sorry, our drop down component, and we're just going to say onClick. So we're going to provide an onClick function, and so that is equal to the curly braces anonymous function, and we're going to say set selected equal to country name. So whatever country name is for that particular element in that array, it will set global just here equal to whatever it is. So just like that. So that's super cool. Excellent, actually. And the last thing I'm going to do is actually just spread this, and I'm going to add one initial parameter, which is going to be global, so that it allows you to reset it to the global state. So just like that, we have a pretty cool drop down. I'm just going to come into our nav bar real quick and just add a Z index here of 20 so that it always sits above. And that's just going to fix any funky styling that we might have. Close that, and now we can get onto styling our main content. So for our main application, we want to render out COVID related data. And so for that, we're actually going to need a second React hook. And so I'm just going to, in here, say const data loading error, and once again use our useFetchData hook, and I'm going to provide a new URL. So this URL is going to be equal to nothing for the particular second, and so that is going to do absolutely nothing. And this main component is going to fetch data depending on whatever country is selected. So we're going to have to pass in that selected country is equal to selected, and we're going to have to receive it in our main. So we're going to say props, he'll say const selected is equal to props, and the first thing we're going to do is just say if selected is equal to global, we're going to render out some content, otherwise we're going to return this content. So we're going to just say something random. So now we can see that if I click global and close that, it's going to do globals, otherwise it's going to render other content. Now the last thing I noticed is that when we click a drop down, we actually want to change the state of open. And so here we manage open, so I'm also just going to have to say set open, set open, just like that. And that's going to allow me to come down into the drop down, deconstruct that, destructure it, sorry, set open. And so when we set this selected country here, we're actually going to set two states at the same time. So not only are we going to set the selected country, but we're going to set open to false. So that's going to close the open when we click on it, just like that, which is super cool. And so the last thing we're actually quickly going to do is we can see that this resizing behavior is kind of odd. And so to deal with that finicky behavior, we're just going to come in here and apply a class name to selected, which is just going to be styles.subtext. And in our nav bar, we're just going to say .subtext. And we're going to add in text overflow ellipsis. White space is going to be no wrap, so that the text doesn't wrap. We're going to say overflow is hidden, and finally just say text overflow ellipsis, which I already have at the top there. And so now we can see that we just get that text ellipse instead of it breaking down onto the next page. So that's nice little handling just there. So that's all good. We can keep moving forward with our project. What comes next, I hear you ask? So the next thing to do is start fetching data in our main component. And that is actually going to be a bit of a breeze. The first thing we're going to do is have to pass it a URL. And so the URL base is going to be the following. So we're just going to copy that base URL in. Now obviously it's not happy and it's failing to get anything. And so we're just going to change this base URL to cases. So now in our main app, we are returning some good content. And we can see that with this URL and using this data hook, we can see that we're actually sending out these case requests and getting them back. So the first one is the countries request. We get a list of all the countries. And here we're getting all of the cases. So that is super cool. We can actually make this even more efficient by just switching this URL to being our main URL in this main page, which is temporarily going to break everything. And instead, when we pass data into our dropdown, this is no longer going to be just countries, because now it's going to be object.keys data. And so we can see that that still works perfectly. We get this long list of countries. We're just reducing it down to one URL. Now the benefit of doing it this way is that when we first load this page, we're actually going to have all of this country data for every different country. And so we can choose what we want to do with this. And so this data is going to be passed into our main component. And so now that we're actually pulling all of the information, we can do a million things with that, but the main thing is that we can pass all of that data into our main component. And in here, we can render out some logic dependent on what our selected key is. So here we have selected. Now what we can do is we could say const data is const cases is equal to, we have to destructure data out of here, and we could just say data and target selected. And so now if we console.log cases, we should be able to refresh this page and see that we get back all of this information specific to these cases. So at the moment it says global and it's giving back us global information. Now if I select Australia, we get Australia specific information, which is super cool. So with that, let's build some cute little graphs and animations. So we're going to quickly make a cases.module.css file. Now, if we look in here at what we get, we just get the current information thus so far. And so we're going to display this using the power of technology. And so all we need to access is actually the all information. So we're just going to say .all. Let's see if that still works for us. So if I now refresh that page and console.log cases, will that work? So that's undefined, so that's still going to have to be a capital all. So that's going to give us all of the information back. And now in here, I'm going to say class name is equal to styles.graph. And so we're going to make a funky little bar graph using some custom styles. And we can achieve that by coming into our cases file. Well, first we actually have to import it. So we're going to say import styles from ./cases.module.css. I believe we'll probably also have to come into our main, this main, and just say display flex direction column. And so now that we've applied that style, we'll fill that in a second, but we're also just going to destructure some stuff from here. So we're just going to say const totals is equal to and create an object. And in here, if I console.log cases, we will see that we get back confirmed, recovered, and deaths. And so what we're just going to do is say confirmed is equal to cases.confirmed. We're going to say recovered is equal to cases.confirmed minus cases.deaths, because you'll notice that recovered is actually returning 0 for some reason, but nevertheless, and we're going to say deaths is equal to cases.deaths. So that's all good. And now if we come into our graph, we're going to apply a style here, and this graph is going to have a position of relative. We're going to give it a height of 400 pixels, a border bottom of 2 pixels solid light blue. We're going to say a display is going to be flex. We're going to say padding bottom 2 pixels. Align items flex end. We're going to say justify content space around, and lastly a gap of 5%. So let's just save that, and now if we come back into this element just here, what we're going to have is some mapped content. So we're going to say object.keys totals. So that's going to take each of the keys confirmed, recovered, and deaths. And we're going to .map, and we're going to take the key, we'll say val, and we'll also take the index, and we are going to return, I think I just need another curly bracket in there, we're going to return some content based on those particular things. So for the second, we could actually just return a div, and we could open this up and we could just have val. And so that's what that looks like on our page. It's kind of nice and responsive, which is super cool. That's good. Now we'll notice that we get this key thing, so we're just going to have to add that in here. Key equals the index. And so we're going to just apply a class name here. Class name is equal to styles.bar. And so what our bars are going to look like is, you will see in just a second, but we're just going to say .bar. We're going to give it a flex of 1. So that's going to occupy some width, and we're going to say a max width of 300 pixels, for example. Let's just see. So that is going to have to be flex end, space around, flex 1. So that's just because there's no content in there. If I say text align center, we can see that now our text is nicely aligned within these elements, so that's super cool. Each of them will be occupying the same amount of space, so we could say background green, for example, and we could just see that each of them kind of has their own space, so that's good. Now, the next thing that we want to do is to specify their height in here, and we're going to do that by applying a height. So style is equal to, and we're going to say height, and the height is going to be dynamic. So we're going to say we're going to need a maximum, so in here we're just going to say const max is equal to object.values totals, and then we can just say math.max and pass that in as a thing and spread it. So we're going to need the maximum value of all of these 3, and what we're going to do here is their height is going to be dependent on the percentage of the maximum that they currently are. So in this particular instance, it would just be totals for the val, which is actually the key, so I guess you could, yeah, that's fine, divided by 100, sorry, divided by max times by 100. So in this particular case, I might just wrap these two in brackets. And then after that, what we can do is just apply a percentage sign. And so now we see we get these bar graphs in here that kind of look a bit neat, except those colors are definitely not going to stay that way. So in here, what we're going to do is remove that and just say .bar1, open that up. And in here, we're going to say background is going to be a linear gradient to top from this particular value just here to this one. Now that's not currently going to do anything, but we will see the benefit of such in a second. So let's just say background green. So we can see that the text is being a bit funny, but we can resolve that in a minute. But the first thing we're going to do is just apply a class name. So here we're going to have multiple class names. So we're going to put these in brackets like that. And then we're going to have a second one, which is going to be $JavaScript styles in here, parentheses. And we're going to have bar index, just like that. So now we can see that that targeted the first element and applied that particular background to it. So now what we could do is just add one for 0. So we actually want that color to be 0. So we're going to come in here and just change that to 0. So that's just one way we can apply a dynamic styling. And then we can have bar 1. And so this one is going to have a slightly different linear gradient. And actually, so just copy this. This is going to be, I'll just go ahead and change this first term, the second term, to maybe something a bit more like that. So it's just a bit darker. Now the recovered is going to be a green. So that will be the recovered. I might make this one a bit lighter. So we'll say blue. I don't like that green though. So let's try this one. Oops, that's definitely not right. And then the last one is going to be a rosy pink red. So we're just going to say bar 2 is going to be background. Copy that, move it down here, remove this, and just paste in that last color. So just like that. But what we are also going to do is just actually remove this text by giving it a class name equal to styles.barLabels. Now we've given this graph a position of absolute, and we're going to have to give this bar a position of relative. So in here, if we just say position relative, we can remove that green. And now what we can do is we can come in here and just say bar labels. We can say position absolute. We can say top 100% so that it sits at the bottom, just like that. We can say text is going to be, that didn't work, text align center. We can say font size maybe 0.7 rem. Okay, we can do bigger than that, 8 rem. We can say left 50%. We can translate x minus 50% of the current width, so that should center it. Nice. I'm going to say text transform uppercase, so it all becomes uppercase text, just like that. Now the other thing we're going to do is just say margin top of 5 pixels, so that it sits a little bit lower. And honestly, that doesn't even look too bad. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is just add some padding around this whole thing, so of 20 pixels, so it sits a little bit smaller. And now we're going to need some values and some lines. So how that's going to work is we are going to come back in here, and inside of this graph div, I'm just going to have an array. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we're going to say .map. And that is going to be val, and we're going to open that up into a new index. And we're just going to return a div, which is going to have class name equal to styles.gridlines. So that's chill. We're also going to have to give it a key, and that's just going to be equal to the val because we know that that will be unique. And now if I come in here and I do .grid lines, we can just say position is once again going to be absolute. And we can say width is 100%, height is 2 pixels. We're going to give it an opacity of 0.7 so that you can't see it 100%. And we're going to say a background of nice bright little color. And then in our main, we're going to manually apply a style of height is equal to, and this is going to be some calculated content. So we're going to do percentages. So we're going to say val times 20 divided by 100. So, and then that should be a percentage. But I think we'll have to, once again, val times 100. I see. So no, the height is actually constant. That was my bad. So the height is 2 pixels, the width is full. We actually want this to say top. So just like that, we're going to get some little grid lines, which are kind of cute. I might actually just say plus 20, because I think we want to shift them all up one. Oops, minus 20. Just like that. And so that is going to just give us some neat little grid lines that we can work with. I think they're way too thick for the second. So I'll change that to 0.5 pixels. Maybe just 1 pixel. And just like that, we kind of have some cute little grid lines. I think we could actually reduce the opacity to 0.5 just so they're a bit more subtle. And you've got your own little graph. Now, the next thing we're going to need is to append some values in here. And that's also pretty easy. But before we do that, we're just quickly going to come back into our bar labels and make user select none so that you can't select the text. So now we have these cool little bars. And so to add in the grid line values, we're going to use these percentages that we've calculated to write in values for these particular gradients. And so we can do that by opening up this div just here, and just by literally stating, we'll do it inside of a paragraph tag. And so we could just add in some JavaScript. And so whatever percentage it may be, so for example, this first value is going to be 1. So that's going to be 1 times by 20 divided by, times by the max divided by 100 as a percentage. Sorry, not as a percentage, but to calculate that value. And so over here, we can probably see that come up. And so we can actually see that the numbers are popping up as to what those values might be. Now, we're just going to have to switch out this term here to be val. And so now all these values will be actually correct, yet we can still see they sit behind. And so we can change that quickly by just saying class name styles.values. So if we come in here and just say .values, we can say text align right. That'll pop them on the right side. And we can say text font size, we could do 1 rem. So we'll say 0.8. And so now you can see that we have all of these values in here. And so now we have these cute little grid labels that kind of show all of the different cases that we may have. Which you can see is heaps of cases. We also just want to say .to fixed, and we're just going to say 0 decimal places so that it's all consistent. And right now I actually have them the wrong way around, so I'm just going to say 5 minus val so that it flips them, and then we're just going to say 4 minus val, 6 minus value. Yeah, just like that. Okay, cool. So that's all of our cases. That's the maximum number. Beautiful. We can see that that works nicely. That's super cool. You can see all the different numbers changing. And so now that we have all of these bar charts working and we can go through and click on the different countries, I've actually decided that we're going to come into our index file and switch up some background colors. So we're going to select this main class and add a background of this color and set the colors to white, and that's going to flip everything into a bit of a dark mode, which I think actually looks a bit better with our entire chart. The next thing we're going to do is come into our cases module, and we're going to change these linear gradients to actually having a white bottom, because that sits better against the backdrop. So I'll change all of them to white. The next thing we're going to do is also change this text color. So this is the values. So we could say here, color white. So we're going to have to unset the opacity here. So we'll remove that. And honestly, that doesn't even look too bad. I think I might just keep it like that. So that's pretty cool. We have our bar charts looking nice and neat. The next thing I'm going to do is come up to our graph, and we're going to just say margin top of 20 pixels just to push it down a little bit. And now that that is looking good, we're also going to come into our nav bar, and in here we're going to say font weight 800. So that's going to become much thicker. But we're also going to add in some extra special styles. So we're going to go -webkit -text -fill color, and we're going to set that to transparent. And then we're going to say -webkit -text stroke. And that's going to be 3 pixels, and it's going to be white. And I need the semicolon there. And now if I save that, we'll see that that gives us this little text effect, except we're just going to have to make sure we get that thickness correct. So maybe, how does 2 pixels look? I reckon we could probably go 1.5. So I think that's kind of fun. It just makes this all look a bit more interesting. And then we could actually just make it so that it only applies to that element just there. And we can do that by looking into our nav bar. And so just in here we have an icon, and we have the subtext. So we can say, so this is subtext, so we can actually select that specifically. So we can say, well, we could just move that just in there like that. And so now that won't apply to our little element over here. And so that will just hover just like that, nice and neat. Super cool. And so now that we have all of our stats, the last thing we're going to do is make a display for all of the information that we have down the bottom. So in main, we're just going to come in here and add a new div. And this is going to have a class name of styles.country info. And in here, we're going to have a map. So that's going to be object.keys. And it's going to be cases, because if we inspect all, we can see that we're console.logging it, and it's giving us this object with all of this interesting information. And so we're just going to come down here and say object.keys cases.map. And we're going to have the val and the index. Open that up, and in here we can just return a div like that. And in this particular case, we could just start off by rendering val. And so here we can see that we get all the information coming down. Now in country info, we're going to have to add a dot class, and we're just going to say margin top of 40 pixels. And so that's just going to make sure that that information is separated. We're also just going to say font weight 200 so that it's a bit thinner, not so heavy. We might also reduce the font size. So we'll say font size of 0.9 rem. I will say text transform upper capitalize is what we want, just like that. And then we're also going to give it a padding of, maybe we can do 10 pixels vertically and 10 pixels horizontally, so you could just add them in standard. we are going to also change this to a display flex. Direction is going to be column, and we're going to say a gap of 4 pixels. So there's a bit of space between each of them, just like that. And then in our main module, we're just going to have to apply some replace all logic. So we're going to replace all, and we're going to select any underscores and replace them with spaces. So that will just take care of that. And now what we're going to do is enter this onto a new line, just like that. And we're going to give this a class name of style.info. Styles.info. And if we come in here, we're going to say .info, and we're going to have display flex, align items center, justify content space between. So that's going to push the answer to the other side. We're going to give this a margin of 0 auto, a max width of 800 pixels. Actually might say 700 pixels. Align item center. Let's think about this for a second. Maybe that's not what we want. Actually, let's just see. Okay, so now in our main, we need to also add the second value. So we're going to add this one in a p tag. So just like that. And then we're going to have a second p tag at the other end, and that's going to have the actual value. So if I can get that p, open that up, and this is going to be cases val, just like that. So now that's not spreading them out like I want it to. We also have to add a key here. Key is equal to index, just like that. So styles.info flex, remove that. Let's remove that for a second. Oh, it'll definitely be that line. Okay, so that's going to do it. So I'll remove this one line here, just like that. So somehow I want to set this so it's centered, and that's actually relatively simple, because here we have country info, and so we can have flex column. We can just justify content center, and so now when I open this, align item center. Okay, well, how about we set the width to max width is 100%. It's going to be, let's say, 100 view width. Actually, let's say 100%. And the width is going to be 400 pixels. So just like that, we can see that that centers it. I might actually just change this to 700. Now, that is going to maintain a maximum width, but on bigger pages, it's just going to give you a bit more space. And so I might just bring that into 600. Just like that. And then after each of these, we're just going to add that little fact there. And so now you can kind of go through and look at all the different stats that you have for each country. And so we can click on Antarctica. Here we can see that we don't have many cases and all this kind of interesting information. And you can totally do whatever you want with that. The last thing we'd probably do is just come into our list here. So where we have our drop down, and we have all of our countries and drop down items. What I would probably do, maybe just add a padding left of 10 pixels. Just so it sits inwards a bit. Cool. Now we can click on global, we get the global stats. Come down here, we can click on Czechoslovakia, we get all, or Denmark, just about anywhere you want. Your graphs are super responsive, looks good on all screens. We can check it out in a mobile view, just by going like that. And we get this nice little display. And overall, it's not a bad little project, kind of neat and fun. So with that, this is our app. You can kind of view all the different stats for the different countries. Nicaragua, wherever you want, Canada, total cases, looks cool, custom graphs, everything like that. But yeah, so thank you for watching. Once again, the link to the code is in the description. If you like the video, subscribe, leave a thumbs up, super appreciated. Let me know if there's anything else you want me to cover, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out. Bye-bye.